On the morning of April 1, 2006, the city of Columbus, Ohio woke up to what seemed like an ordinary Saturday. Students nursed hangovers from Friday night celebrations. Restaurants prepared for the lunch rush. Traffic moved through the city without interruption. To almost everyone, it was just another weekend. But for one family, something was already terribly wrong. A 27-year-old medical student named Brian Shaffer had vanished. At first, nobody understood the significance of that fact. Adults don't usually trigger immediate panic when they fail to come home after a night out. Phones die. Plans change. Friends crash on couches. People sleep through alarms. But as the hours passed, a disturbing realization began to take shape. Nobody could find Brian. No one had heard from him. And no one knew where he had gone. What began as a simple missing person report would eventually evolve into one of the most baffling disappearances in modern American history. Because unlike many missing person cases, investigators knew exactly where Brian had been. They knew who he was with. They knew what he was doing. They even had surveillance footage showing some of his final known movements. Yet despite all of that information, a question remains unanswered nearly 2 decades later. How does someone disappear from one of the busiest entertainment districts in a major American city without leaving a trace? To understand the mystery, investigators first had to understand the man at the center of it. And by all accounts, Brian Shaffer was not someone anyone expected to vanish. Born and raised in Ohio, Brian was intelligent, ambitious, and driven. Friends often described him as charismatic and outgoing. He had the kind of personality that naturally drew people toward him. He was known for his sense of humor, his confidence, and his ability to make friends easily. Those qualities helped him navigate one of the most demanding educational paths imaginable. By 2006, Brian was a second-year medical student at Ohio State University College of Medicine. Medical school is notoriously difficult. The workload is relentless. The pressure is constant. And the competition can be overwhelming. Yet Brian appeared to be handling it. He was pursuing a career that promised both stability and purpose. The years of sacrifice seemed to be paying off. He was steadily moving toward his goal of becoming a physician. From the outside, his future looked bright. But beneath that promising future, Brian was carrying a burden that few people could truly understand. Just weeks before his disappearance, his family had experienced a devastating loss. Brian's mother, Renee Shaffer, had died after a lengthy battle with cancer. The loss struck the family hard. Cancer had dominated their lives for years. Watching a loved one fight a prolonged illness is emotionally exhausting, and by the time Renee passed away, the family had endured a tremendous amount of pain. For Brian, the loss was particularly significant. Those who knew him said he was deeply affected by his mother's death. He had been close to her. Her illness had weighed heavily on him. And although he continued moving forward with his daily life, there was no question that he was grieving. The death became one of the central facts investigators would later examine when trying to understand his disappearance. Did grief play a role? Did it influence his decisions? Did it affect his state of mind? Those questions would linger for years. At the time, however, Brian appeared determined to keep going. He continued attending medical school. He maintained relationships with friends. And he remained involved in plans for the future. One of the most important people in his life was his girlfriend, Alexis Wagoner. The two had been in a serious relationship and were discussing future plans together. In fact, they had recently been preparing for a vacation. The trip represented something important. It was a chance to escape the stress of school. A chance to relax. A chance to look ahead instead of backward. Friends and family later pointed to those plans as evidence that Brian remained invested in his future. Nothing about his actions suggested someone preparing to disappear. Nothing suggested someone preparing to abandon his life. As March came to an end, Brian's routine appeared largely unchanged. He attended classes, spent time with friends, and tried to balance the pressures of medical school with the normal experiences of being a young adult. Then came Friday, March 31st, 2006. The day that would become the final day anyone could account for with certainty. That evening began in a completely ordinary way. Brian made plans to meet friends and enjoy a night out. There was nothing unusual about the decision. College campuses and entertainment districts across America were filled with students doing exactly the same thing. For Brian and his friends, it was simply the start of a weekend. One of the people he met that night was Clint Florence, a longtime friend. The two had known each other for years. Clint would later become one of the most important witnesses in the investigation because he spent much of Brian's final known evening with him. Also joining them was Meredith Reed. The group planned to spend the evening socializing and visiting local bars. Nothing about the plan raised concerns. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary. And if someone had told any of them that this night would become one of the most scrutinized evenings in true crime history, they likely would have laughed. Because at that moment, it was simply a night out among friends. As darkness settled over Columbus, the city came alive. The neighborhoods surrounding Ohio State University were busy. Bars filled with students. Music spilled into the streets. And thousands of people moved through the area enjoying the start of the weekend. The entertainment district known as South Campus Gateway had become one of the most popular nightlife destinations near campus. Restaurants, shops, and bars attracted large crowds. Among those establishments was a venue known as the Ugly Tuna Saloon. The bar occupied an upper level within the complex and had become a favorite destination for students and young adults. By late evening, the venue was crowded. Music played loudly. Conversations blended together into a constant roar. Bartenders worked quickly to keep up with orders. And people moved continuously between tables, entrances, and exits. It was exactly the kind of environment where people could easily become separated from their friends. And it was exactly the kind of environment where investigators would later struggle to reconstruct every movement. Throughout the evening, witnesses described Brian as normal. He talked with friends. He drank socially. He interacted with people around him. Nothing indicated that he was in distress. Nothing suggested he was planning anything unusual. In fact, nearly every witness account painted the same picture. Brian seemed relaxed. Comfortable. Engaged. Present. The night continued without incident. Hours passed. The crowd shifted. People arrived and left. And eventually the evening moved toward closing time. What happened next would become the focal point of the entire investigation. Shortly before 2 a.m., surveillance cameras captured Brian near the entrance area of the Ugly Tuna Saloon. The footage would later become some of the most analyzed video in missing person history. In the recording, Brian appears calm. There is no visible sign of panic. No indication of conflict. No obvious threat. At one point, he is seen talking with two women. The interaction appears casual. Investigators later identified and interviewed both women. Neither provided information suggesting anything unusual occurred. As far as anyone could tell, it was just another ordinary conversation during a night out. Yet that brief interaction would take on enormous significance. Because it became one of the final confirmed moments anyone could place Brian Shaffer alive. The timestamp approached 2 a.m. Closing time. The period when bars begin emptying and patrons head home. For investigators, this stretch of time would become critical. Somewhere within the next few minutes, Brian disappeared from the known timeline. At first, nobody realized it. Friends were focused on ending the night. People were moving everywhere. Crowds flowed toward exits. The atmosphere was chaotic in the way nightlife districts often are during closing time. When Clint Florence and Meredith Reed prepared to leave, they expected Brian to emerge as well. But he didn't. Initially, that wasn't alarming. Anyone who has spent time in crowded bars understands how easily groups become separated. A friend stops to talk. Someone heads to the restroom. Another person leaves through a different doorway. These things happen constantly. So when Brian wasn't immediately visible, Clint and Meredith assumed he would show up shortly. They waited. Then they waited a little longer. Still no Brian. At some point they began searching nearby areas. They looked around. Tried to locate him. And attempted to determine whether he had left with someone else. Nothing seemed especially concerning yet. The most reasonable explanation was that Brian had simply gone home independently. Eventually, that assumption won out. The evening ended. Everyone went their separate ways. And Brian's disappearance remained unnoticed. For the moment. The following day changed everything. As Saturday progressed, people began expecting to hear from Brian. Family members expected contact. Friends expected communication. Alexis expected communication. But the calls never came. The messages went unanswered. And something that initially seemed harmless began to feel deeply unsettling. Brian was not the kind of person who simply vanished from communication. He had responsibilities. Relationships. Commitments. A future he had spent years building. As concern intensified, efforts to locate him began. Friends started making calls. Family members searched for answers. And before long, authorities became involved. What investigators initially expected to be a routine missing person inquiry soon transformed into something else entirely. Because the more they examined Brian's final known movements, the stranger the case became. They knew where he had spent the evening. They knew who had seen him. They knew approximately when he was last observed. And most importantly, they had surveillance footage. At first glance, that seemed like a tremendous advantage. In many missing person investigations, detectives have far less information. Often there are no witnesses. No cameras. No timeline. But Brian's case appeared different. The footage, investigators believed, would provide answers. They simply needed to follow his movements and identify where he went after leaving the bar. It sounded straightforward. Instead, it would become one of the most frustrating investigations of their careers. Because when detectives began reviewing the recordings, they discovered something that made no sense. They could see Brian entering the area. They could see him inside the complex. They could see him near the entrance shortly before closing. But when they searched for footage showing him leaving, they couldn't find it. That realization marked the beginning of the mystery. A mystery that would consume investigators, journalists, internet communities, and true crime audiences for years. Somewhere between Brian's final appearance on camera and the moment the crowds dispersed into the Columbus night, something happened. Something investigators have never been able to fully explain. And as detectives prepared to dig deeper into the surveillance footage, interview witnesses, and reconstruct every minute of Brian's final known night, one question began to overshadow every other. If Brian entered the bar, how did he leave? For investigators, the first priority was obvious. Find Brian Shaffer's route out of the South Campus Gateway complex. It seemed like a simple task. After all, this wasn't an isolated rural area with no witnesses and no surveillance. Brian had spent his final known hours inside one of the busiest nightlife districts in Columbus. Hundreds of people were present. Cameras were operating. Employees were working. Friends had been with him for much of the night. The assumption was that somewhere in the footage, detectives would find the answer. They would watch Brian leave. Then they would follow his movements beyond the bar. And eventually they would discover where the trail led. But almost immediately, the investigation encountered a problem. The footage wasn't telling a complete story. Detectives began collecting surveillance recordings from multiple cameras positioned throughout the South Campus Gateway complex. They reviewed entrances, exits, corridors, and common areas. Frame by frame, they reconstructed the movements of patrons entering and leaving the venue. What they expected to find was a clean sequence. Brian enters. Brian spends time inside. Brian exits. Instead, the sequence seemed incomplete. Investigators could identify Brian arriving at the complex earlier in the evening. They could identify him inside the area near the Ugly Tuna Saloon. And they could identify him speaking with two women shortly before closing time. Then the trail became uncertain. At first, detectives assumed they had simply missed him. Surveillance footage can be deceptive. Crowded environments create visual confusion. People block one another from view. Cameras operate from limited angles. Lighting conditions reduce clarity. A person can appear in one frame and disappear behind a group in the next. So investigators reviewed the footage again. And again. And again. The more they watched, the more troubling the situation became. They still couldn't definitively identify Brian leaving through the main public exit. The discovery would eventually become the defining feature of the entire case. To the public, it sounded almost impossible. How could someone enter a building and never leave? But investigators knew the reality was more complicated. The South Campus Gateway complex was not a simple structure. And understanding that structure became essential. The Ugly Tuna Saloon occupied an upper-level location within the Gateway complex. Patrons typically accessed the establishment using an escalator and surrounding walkways leading to the entrance. The public narrative that later emerged often simplified the layout into a single entrance and a single exit. That wasn't entirely accurate. The building contained multiple operational areas. Service corridors. Restricted access routes. Maintenance pathways. Construction zones. Employee entrances. Loading areas. And various architectural features that complicated surveillance coverage. The question wasn't whether exits existed. The question was whether Brian used one that investigators could not fully document. As detectives studied architectural plans, they began examining every possible route a person could have taken after leaving the bar. One possibility quickly attracted attention. A service exit located near the rear of the establishment. Unlike the main public entrance, this route was primarily intended for employees and operational use. It wasn't designed for regular customer traffic. Yet it was physically accessible. If Brian somehow moved through that area, he could potentially have bypassed portions of the surveillance network. The theory immediately generated interest. For the first time, investigators had a plausible explanation for how Brian might leave the building without appearing clearly on camera. But there was a problem. The theory explained how he could disappear from the surveillance timeline. It did not explain what happened afterward. Even if Brian left through a service route, he still had to go somewhere. He still had to enter the city beyond the complex. He still had to interact with the outside world. The service exit solved only one piece of the puzzle. It didn't solve the mystery itself. Meanwhile, investigators continued interviewing witnesses. Employees were questioned. Patrons were questioned. Security personnel were questioned. Anyone who might have seen Brian during the final stages of the evening became potentially important. Many people remembered seeing him earlier. Very few could place him after the final confirmed sighting. And none could provide a definitive account of his departure. That absence became increasingly significant. In a crowded environment, people are often observed without realizing it. Someone remembers a face. A bartender recalls a conversation. A patron remembers bumping into another customer. Yet despite extensive efforts, nobody emerged with a clear description of Brian's final movements. As investigators expanded their search, another factor complicated the case. At the time of Brian's disappearance, portions of the area surrounding the complex were undergoing development activity. Construction zones create unique investigative challenges. Temporary fencing changes routes of travel. Equipment creates blind spots. Access points appear and disappear. Areas that normally attract attention become overlooked because everyone assumes workers have already checked them. Detectives had to consider whether construction activity influenced Brian's movements. Could he have entered an unfinished area? Could he have taken a route hidden from cameras? Could an accident have occurred within a location that investigators initially overlooked? The possibility could not be ignored. Search efforts expanded accordingly. Authorities examined construction-related areas. They evaluated access points. They reviewed the physical environment surrounding the complex. Nothing significant was discovered. No evidence placed Brian within the construction zones. No physical trace connected him to an accident site. No witness described seeing him enter a restricted area. Once again, investigators found themselves confronting uncertainty. The mystery deepened further as surveillance specialists became involved. Experts reviewed camera placement, field of view, recording quality, coverage gaps, and timing sequences. One important realization emerged from these reviews. The public often assumed the surveillance system provided complete coverage of every movement through the building. In reality, no camera system is perfect. Blind spots existed. Certain routes were more visible than others. Some movements could occur between cameras. Others could occur in areas where coverage was limited or non-existent. This realization changed how investigators viewed the case. The disappearance was no longer framed as a supernatural impossibility. It became a question of probability. Could Brian have exited through a route that simply wasn't captured clearly enough to identify him? Many detectives believed the answer was yes. But that still left the larger question unanswered. What happened next? Because even if surveillance failed to document his exit, Brian should have appeared somewhere afterward. A witness should have seen him. A camera should have recorded him. A transaction should have occurred. A phone call should have been made. Some trace should have existed. Yet none appeared. As weeks passed, detectives widened their search beyond the Gateway complex. Hospitals were checked. Jails were checked. Emergency services records were reviewed. Potential sightings were investigated. Nothing produced results. The city seemed to have swallowed Brian whole. Public awareness began growing. Local news outlets covered the disappearance extensively. The combination of factors proved irresistible. A young medical student. A crowded entertainment district. Surveillance footage. And an unexplained disappearance. Viewers quickly became fascinated. Tips started arriving. Many were well-intentioned. Most led nowhere. But investigators followed them anyway. Every lead mattered. Every possibility deserved examination. Some tips suggested Brian had been seen elsewhere in Columbus. Others claimed he had traveled to another state. A few even alleged sightings in completely different regions of the country. None could be verified. The investigation continued. Behind the scenes, detectives were beginning to divide possible explanations into categories. The first category involved a simple unnoticed exit. Under this scenario, Brian left the complex through a route that surveillance failed to capture conclusively. Once outside, he encountered circumstances unrelated to the bar itself. Perhaps an accident. Perhaps a crime. Perhaps something entirely unexpected. This explanation required no elaborate conspiracy. No hidden event inside the building. No impossible disappearance. Just an unnoticed departure followed by an unrelated tragedy. Many investigators considered this possibility highly plausible. But plausibility wasn't enough. Evidence was still missing. The second category involved something occurring within or immediately around the Gateway complex. Supporters of this idea argued that Brian's disappearance seemed too abrupt. Too complete. They questioned whether investigators had fully reconstructed his final moments. Could an encounter have occurred after the cameras lost track of him? Could he have entered an area never thoroughly documented? Could witnesses have missed something critical? Again, no evidence confirmed such a scenario. But the unanswered questions kept it alive. As months passed, detectives returned repeatedly to the surveillance footage. Every review carried the same hope. Perhaps something had been overlooked. Perhaps a tiny detail hidden among thousands of frames would suddenly become obvious. Investigators scrutinized clothing. Body movements. Groups entering and leaving. Individuals partially obscured by crowds. The effort consumed countless hours. Yet the fundamental mystery remained. The exit problem became the lens through which every theory would later be examined. Accident theories. Crime theories. Voluntary disappearance theories. Every possibility had to answer the same question. How did Brian leave the known timeline? Years later, the phrase would still define the case. Not because it solved the mystery, but because it perfectly described the obstacle preventing anyone from solving it. Somewhere between Brian's final confirmed appearance and the moment the crowds dispersed into the Columbus night, a crucial event occurred. An event nobody could fully reconstruct. An event that separated known facts from speculation. And as investigators exhausted every avenue within the Gateway complex, they were forced to confront a difficult reality. The building itself might never provide the answer. To move forward, they would have to look beyond the cameras. Beyond the architecture. Beyond the exit. As the weeks following Brian Shaffer's disappearance turned into months, investigators found themselves confronting a troubling reality. The physical trail had ended. Searches had produced nothing. Surveillance footage had reached its limits. Witness interviews had generated more questions than answers. And no matter how many times detectives retraced Brian's final known movements, they always arrived at the same point. The moment where certainty stopped. At that stage, every missing person investigation faces a difficult transition. When evidence becomes scarce, investigators must begin examining possibilities. Not because they know which explanation is correct, but because understanding what might have happened is often the only way to uncover what actually happened. National audiences began discovering the case. Television programs featured it. Podcasts discussed it. Internet communities analyzed every available detail. Thousands of people began conducting their own investigations. The rise of online true crime culture added a new dimension. Amateur researchers reviewed surveillance footage frame by frame. Discussion boards dissected witness statements. Maps were created. Timelines were reconstructed. Theories multiplied. Some were reasonable. Others became increasingly speculative. Among the more controversial ideas was the suggestion that Brian's disappearance connected to a larger pattern. Supporters pointed to other cases involving young men who vanished after nights out. Over time, these discussions became associated with what is commonly known as the smiley face theory. The theory proposes that certain disappearances and deaths may be connected through organized criminal activity. The concept remains highly controversial. Critics argue that many supposed connections rely on coincidence rather than evidence. Investigators in Brian's case never publicly identified evidence establishing a link between his disappearance and such a network. Yet the theory persisted because people were desperate for answers. When mysteries remain unsolved, the human mind naturally searches for patterns. Sometimes those patterns reveal truth. Sometimes they reveal only our desire for explanations. As speculation expanded, law enforcement remained focused on evidence. And evidence continued pointing toward the same frustrating conclusion. No theory fully explained the case. Accidental death had strengths. People sometimes suffer fatal accidents after nights out. Alcohol can impair judgment. Unexpected hazards exist. Construction zones existed nearby. Roadways existed nearby. Countless risks existed beyond the bar district. The theory required no suspect. No conspiracy. No elaborate plan. But it faced a serious challenge. Where was the evidence? Searches failed to uncover remains. No accident scene emerged. No physical trace supported the explanation. The theory was plausible, yet unsupported. Foul play also possessed strengths. A random encounter could explain Brian's sudden disappearance. A crime could explain the absence of communication. A successful concealment could explain why no evidence surfaced immediately. But once again, proof remained elusive. No suspect. No witnesses. No crime scene. No confession. Nothing substantial connected Brian to a known act of violence. Voluntary disappearance explained some elements too. The lack of a body. The complete silence. The abrupt end to the known timeline. But it struggled against the realities of Brian's life. His future plans. His relationships. His education. His finances. And the complete absence of evidence suggesting preparation. Every theory answered some questions. Every theory created new ones. By the end of the first year, investigators found themselves confronting a difficult truth. The case wasn't becoming clearer. It was becoming more complicated. Because the deeper they dug, the more they realized something unsettling. The disappearance of Brian Shaffer wasn't a mystery with no clues. It was a mystery with too many incomplete clues. Enough information to generate theories. Not enough information to prove any of them. And somewhere hidden among those fragments of evidence was the truth. A truth that remained frustratingly out of reach. Yet even as theories multiplied and public attention grew, another dimension of the story was unfolding. Away from the cameras. Away from internet debates. Away from the endless speculation. A family was still waiting. A father was refusing to give up. And in the years ahead, that determination would become one of the most emotional chapters in the entire case. Because while the world debated what happened to Brian Shaffer, the people who loved him were still searching for answers. As the first year of Brian Shaffer's disappearance came to a close, one reality had become impossible to ignore. The investigation had stalled. Every major lead had been explored. Every known witness had been interviewed. Surveillance footage had been analyzed repeatedly. Searches had been conducted. Tips had been followed. And yet Brian remained missing. For law enforcement, the case had become one of the most frustrating mysteries imaginable. For Brian's family, however, the experience was something far worse. Because investigations eventually become files. Families never get that luxury. For them, the mystery remains personal. Every day. Every holiday. Every birthday. Every unanswered phone call. Every empty chair at a family gathering. The disappearance wasn't an unsolved case. It was a missing son. And no one felt that reality more deeply than Brian's father. Randy Shaffer refused to stop searching. In the months following Brian's disappearance, Randy became the public face of the family's efforts. He participated in interviews. Appeared in media coverage. Worked alongside investigators. And continued pushing for answers long after many people would have surrendered to uncertainty. Those who followed the case often remarked on his determination. He understood that public attention mattered. The more people who knew Brian's story, the greater the chance that someone might remember something important. Someone might come forward. Someone might finally provide the missing piece. So Randy kept talking. Kept searching. Kept hoping. That hope was tested repeatedly. Over the years, reported sightings began arriving from across the country. Some callers claimed they had seen Brian in another city. Others believed they had encountered him in another state. A few reports even suggested sightings far from Ohio. Each lead created a familiar cycle. Excitement. Investigation. Disappointment. Authorities examined the reports carefully. Witnesses were interviewed. Information was compared. Whenever possible, sightings were investigated. None could be verified. Time after time, promising leads dissolved under scrutiny. The pattern became painfully familiar. A potential breakthrough would emerge. Public attention would surge. Then the lead would collapse. And the mystery would remain exactly where it had been before. Meanwhile, the years continued passing. As time moved forward, investigators faced another challenge common to long-term missing person cases. Memories fade. Witnesses relocate. Records become harder to obtain. Businesses close. Physical environments change. The Columbus that existed in 2006 gradually disappeared. Buildings were renovated. Businesses changed ownership. People moved on with their lives. Yet Brian's disappearance remained frozen in time. Investigators continued revisiting evidence whenever new information emerged. Occasionally, advancements in technology offered fresh opportunities. Video enhancement techniques improved. Digital analysis improved. Data management systems improved. Each advancement created hope that something overlooked might finally reveal itself. Again and again, detectives returned to the surveillance footage. The same footage. The same final images. The same unanswered questions. But despite years of review, the central mystery refused to budge. The footage never provided a definitive exit. The timeline never fully extended beyond the final confirmed sighting. And the case gradually entered a phase every investigator dreads. Cold case status. That label often creates a misunderstanding. People hear the phrase, cold case, and assume an investigation has ended. In reality, many cold cases remain active. Tips continue arriving. Evidence continues being reviewed. Detectives continue searching for answers. The difference is that progress becomes slower. The easy leads are gone. Only the difficult questions remain. Brian's case fit that description perfectly. By now, investigators had largely identified the major possibilities. Accident. Foul play. Voluntary disappearance. Yet none of them could be proven. As the mystery matured, public fascination continued growing. The internet ensured that Brian's story never completely disappeared. Documentaries featured the case. Podcasts revisited it. Online communities debated it. New generations discovered the mystery and became convinced they could solve it. Many focused on details that seemed especially significant. The service exit. The construction zone. The cell phone activity. The final conversation with the two women. The surveillance blind spots. The timeline between closing time and Brian's disappearance. Each detail inspired new theories. Some were thoughtful. Some were highly speculative. Yet all shared a common goal. Finding an explanation that fit the known facts. Unfortunately, the known facts remained stubbornly resistant to explanation. The deeper people examined the evidence, the more obvious the central problem became. Every theory required assumptions. Accidental death required an accident that left little or no evidence. Foul play required a crime with no confirmed suspect. Voluntary disappearance required preparation that investigators never found. Theories could explain portions of the mystery. None could explain everything. As experts reviewed the case over the years, many arrived at a similar conclusion. The answer likely lies in the period immediately following Brian's departure from the known timeline. Not hours later. Not days later. Minutes later. Whatever happened probably occurred shortly after the last confirmed sighting. That conclusion may sound obvious. Yet it carries important implications. If Brian suffered an accident, it likely happened soon after leaving the complex. If he encountered foul play, the encounter likely occurred shortly afterward. If he disappeared voluntarily, the decision was likely made during that same narrow window. In other words, the critical event may have taken place within minutes of investigators losing sight of him. And because those minutes remain unaccounted for, the mystery remains unsolved. Some investigators have privately suggested that the case may ultimately be less mysterious than it appears. Not because the answer is simple. But because the surveillance issue often overshadows everything else. To the public, the phrase, "he was never seen leaving," sounds supernatural. Almost impossible. Yet investigators familiar with surveillance systems understand that people sometimes move through blind spots. They sometimes evade clear identification unintentionally. Crowded environments create confusion. Camera coverage is rarely perfect. Under that interpretation, Brian may simply have left through a route that cameras failed to document clearly. If that's true, the real mystery begins after the surveillance footage ends. Not within it. Others remain unconvinced. They argue that the extraordinary absence of evidence suggests something more unusual occurred. A hidden confrontation. An overlooked event. A critical detail investigators never discovered. Reasonable people continue to disagree. And that disagreement persists because the case never produced the evidence needed to settle the debate. Nearly 2 decades later, Brian Shaffer remains missing. No verified contact. No confirmed sightings. No known financial activity. No identified remains. No proven explanation. The passage of time has only deepened the mystery. In many cases, years eventually reveal answers. Witnesses come forward. Evidence emerges. Mistakes are corrected. Secrets unravel. But Brian's disappearance has resisted all of those forces. The mystery remains remarkably intact. And perhaps that's why it continues captivating people. Most missing person cases involve uncertainty. Brian's case involves contradiction. There is enough evidence to create confidence. Yet not enough evidence to create certainty. Investigators know where he spent the evening. They know who he spent it with. They know what he was doing. They know what he was wearing. They know when he was last seen. And still they cannot explain what happened. That combination is extraordinarily rare. As the years passed, tragedy struck the Shaffer family again. Randy Shaffer, who had spent years searching for answers about his son, died without ever learning what happened to Brian. For many observers, that reality became one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the case. A father devoted years of his life to finding his son. Yet the answer remained out of reach. The loss added another layer of sadness to an already devastating story. Today, Brian's case occupies a unique place in American true crime. It is frequently described as one of the most baffling disappearances ever documented. Not because investigators lacked evidence, but because they possessed enough evidence to understand the beginning of the story. Just not the ending. And perhaps that is the most unsettling aspect of all. Imagine standing inside the South Campus Gateway complex during those final minutes. Music playing. Crowds moving. People laughing. Friends saying goodbye. Nothing appears unusual. Nothing suggests history is unfolding. Somewhere within that ordinary scene is Brian Shaffer. A young medical student. A son. A boyfriend. A friend. A man with plans for the future. He speaks with two women. He moves through the crowd. He takes a few more steps. And then, the story disappears. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Not with a scream. Not with a struggle captured on camera. Just a quiet transition from certainty into uncertainty. The kind that keeps investigators awake at night. The kind that keeps families searching. The kind that transforms a missing person case into a lasting mystery. Nearly 20 years later, the footage still exists. The witnesses still exist. The theories still exist. The questions still exist. But the answer does not. Somewhere beyond that final confirmed sighting lies the truth. Perhaps it is simple. Perhaps it is shocking. Perhaps it has been overlooked all along. Until that truth is discovered, Brian Shaffer's disappearance will remain one of the most perplexing unsolved mysteries in modern America. A man walked into a crowded nightlife district. Hundreds of people surrounded him. Cameras recorded him. Friends spent the evening with him. The city moved around him. Life continued around him. And then, somehow, he vanished into the night. The mystery of Brian Shaffer is not merely the story of a missing person. It is the story of a missing moment. A single missing moment that has never been found.